let's get started. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to finish up this chapter on the autonomic nervous system, which is chapter 15. We just have a little bit left to cover, and then we're going to start chapter 17, which is on the endocrine system. Okay. So today I'll probably just kind of giving you an introduction to the endocrine system. All right. And that'll be our last chapter then before our first exam. So this is the slide where we left off on Monday, okay? So which division of the autonomic nervous system were we talking about here? If you look at this diagram, what is this showing? Which division? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Sympathetic? Okay, how do you know that? You just remember, okay, okay. Well, who could tell me a clue that this is a diagram of the sympathetic division? Okay. No, you're probably.
Because it extends all the way from the cervical all the way down to the coccygeal or whatever.
Where you're close, yeah. The pathways originate from T1 to L2. Okay, so so this blue here is the thoracic region. So this is T1 and it's going all the way down here to L2. Okay, that's one clue. What's another clue that we're looking at a diagram of the sympathetic division? Think of those characteristics that were in that table that we looked at. So what's one anatomical difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic division? Okay, I'll give you a clue. How about the relative lengths of the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons? How are those different?
Sympathetic ones are shorter.
Which ones? The preganglionic? Right. The preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division are relatively short, and most of them synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, right along here. Okay. There are some that synapse outside of the sympathetic chain. Those are called prevertebral ganglia, or collateral ganglia is another name for them. But most of them are relatively short, and then from there, the postganglionic neurons carry the signals to the effector organ. Okay, so yeah, this is a diagram of the sympathetic division. Okay, and then I pointed out that along the trunk, the preganglionic neurons come together to form three nerves, and these are the names of those three nerves that are formed by the preganglionic fibers. You can see those on the inside of the dorsal body wall on a person or a cadaver. Okay, now another part of the sympathetic division that you might not think of at first is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, well, first of all, the adrenal glands are a pair of glands that sit right on top of the kidneys. And they're unusual in that part of those glands make up an endocrine gland, which secretes hormones that regulate things like blood sugar, and it does a number of other things as well. And then the outer layer of tissue that makes up the adrenal glands, the outer layer is the endocrine gland. The deeper portions, which is the adrenal medulla, those cells release a hormone called epinephrine. But the adrenal medulla is actually thought to be made up of modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And one one piece of evidence that that's the case is that the chemical that secretes epinephrine, which also goes by the name of adrenaline, is chemically very, very similar to norepinephrine, which is the neurotransmitter that's released by the sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And epinephrine or adrenaline has the same effects as norepinephrine on target organs. Okay? So when the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is activated, in addition to increasing the secretion of norepinephrine from all of the postganglionic neurons, the sympathetic division also activates the release of epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And that epinephrine goes into the bloodstream, just like a hormone, and it circulates through the bloodstream, and it causes a mass activation of all the organs that have adrenergic receptors, receptors to norepinephrine or epinephrine. And so those result in a very generalized fight or flight response. Okay? So this sort of supplements the norepinephrine that's released by the sympathetic pathways. Okay? So this is considered to be another part of the sympathetic division. Even though the organ looks like an endocrine gland, it is in part. The adrenal cortex is an endocrine gland, but the adrenal medulla is actually part of the sympathetic division. All right. Then the other division is the parasympathetic division. Parasympathetic division, besides being sometimes called the cranial sacral division, is also known as the rest and digest division, because the parasympathetic fibers are most active when a person is resting and digesting your food. And so the effects of the parasympathetic division are just the opposite of the sympathetic division. And as I said, it's most active during rest. And so the parasympathetic division conserves energy, and it also promotes digestion, because it's easiest to digest your food during rest. So this is a diagram of the parasympathetic division. And again, the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are color-coded. The preganglionic neurons are colored green. Now, notice that this preganglionic neuron that's going to the heart, notice it extends all the way to the heart. But there is a very short postganglionic neuron, but it's right on the surface of the heart. Okay, so parasympathetic division has very long preganglionic and relatively short postganglionic neurons. Okay, and as you can see on here, most of the parasympathetic fibers travel through some of the cranial nerves. There are fibers that travel through the oculomotor, which is cranial nerve 3, supply smooth muscles that are located in the eye. Some of them pass through cranial nerve, the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. Those supply the salivary glands and cause the salivary glands to release their secretions, which is called saliva. Some of them go through the glossopharyngeal nerve, and some of them go through the vagus nerve. Okay, so those are all pathways that originate from the brain, which is the cranial portion of the cranial sacral division. Down here in the bottom, though, notice there are some parasympathetic fibers coming off of the sacral portion of the spinal cord, namely spinal nerves S2 through S4. Those supply organs such as the urinary bladder, the genitals, and also the reproductive organs. Okay? So There are not too many exceptions to the general rule for the parasympathetic division. Most of those characteristics that we described earlier generally always hold for the parasympathetic division. So the postganglionic neurons, for example, always release acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine always binds to a muscarinic receptor. Sympathetic division is a little more variable because those sympathetic pathways that travel to sweat glands and some blood vessels, instead of releasing norepinephrine onto the effector organ, those that travel to those effector organs release acetylcholine, so which is kind of an exception to the general rule. All right. Okay, now in the parasympathetic division, these preganglionic fibers that come off of S2 through S4, they kind of run together to form another nerve that's called the pelvic splanchnic nerve. And that supplies, like I said, the genitals and the urinary bladder. Most of those organs are located in the pelvic cavity. Okay, let's do some review questions. Okay, first question. Acetylcholine released by preganglionic neurons binds to what kind of receptor? And this is actually shown in that one table that compares the characteristics of the two divisions. Still have a couple people that need to answer. If not, you'll have another opportunity to answer a question a little bit later. So, most of you said nicotinic receptors, and that's correct. So the acetylcholine is released by the preganglionic neurons or presynaptic neurons, and both divisions release acetylcholine, and it binds to nicotinic receptors. Okay. Next question. The acetylcholine released by parasympathetic postganglionic fibers. What receptor do those bind to? Everybody answered? Remember, you're not graded on this, so I just use this to give you some examples of questions that types of questions that might be on the exam. And also I use this to take attendance, so. All right, everybody's answered now, so. Okay, most of you said muscarinic receptors, and that of course is correct. Okay, all right, so that's the end of chapter 15. So now we're gonna start chapter 17. Okay. Before we begin, I want to tell you a story that I just heard a little while ago, just before class. And I read about it on social media. And it was a story about, apparently earlier today, a member of the public called into the police to report a motorist on I-90. I think it was somewhere near the Salem exit. But anyway, they're weaving all over the road across both lanes, going into the ditch, going out of the ditch. So they thought that they were drunk. So the police went after them, and they caught up to them and tried to pull them over, and they wouldn't pull over. So police tried to get in front of them to get them to stop, and finally they stopped right in the middle of one of the driving lanes. I'm not sure which direction they were going, but I think they were going westbound. I could be wrong though. But anyway, police officer went up to the car, and after it stopped, and the driver was unconscious or asleep, one of the two. And so the police officer looked in the back seat, and there was a cooler back there. So he looked in the cooler, and there was a vial of insulin and a syringe in there. So he thought, oh, this guy must be a diabetic. And that's why he's unconscious. That's why he was driving erratically. Sometimes that happens with diabetics. Okay. So the police officer filled a syringe with some insulin and injected it into the driver. I see you're cringing. Why are you cringing?
I guess as a nursing major, you don't just inject, especially if you don't know a person, you don't know the amount they need, because there's math that goes into how much insulin, because you can put them into a coma for having.
That's right. That's right. Because usually the reason diabetics become unresponsive is because their blood sugar is getting too low. So what happens in diabetes is that either your body is not producing enough insulin, which is needed for your cells to absorb glucose, or your cells just don't respond, they just stop responding to glucose, and so the cells can't take up glucose anymore. And that causes your blood sugar to become higher than normal. And usually you could tell because the blood sugar gets too high, the kidneys can't reabsorb all of the sugar in the blood, and so you find high levels of sugar in the urine. That's one sign of diabetes. So, I mean, one reason people become unresponsive, have diabetes, is because they may have taken too much insulin. If you take too much insulin, your blood sugar is going to become dangerously low, and that can cause a person to go into a coma if it goes too low. Actually, it could cause a person to die. So insulin decreases blood sugar. So if the person's blood sugar was already low, would you want to give them more insulin? No, that would make it worse. Yeah. So I question whether that was a good idea or not. So I asked one of the nursing instructors. I said, "Am I right? Is that the wrong thing to do?" They go, "Yeah, that's the opposite thing you should." Normally, when you find a diabetic that's unresponsive, normally it's because their blood sugar is low. So what do you have to do?
Eat something. Sugar.
Give them sugar, yeah, to bring their blood sugar back up. So sometimes diabetics will drink orange juice, or somebody will give them orange juice to drink, or some of them actually carry glucose tablets. And then take a glucose tablet, that'll bring their blood sugar back up. Then they probably need to go talk to the endocrinologist to find out why their blood sugar got too low. Maybe they need to adjust their dose of insulin. So anyway, that has to do with chapter 17 that we're going to talk about today. Because insulin is produced by the pancreas, which is one of the endocrine glands. So the body actually has 4 different mechanisms of communication between cells. One of them that allows adjacent cells to communicate is by way of gap junctions. Gap junctions are protein complexes between 2 adjacent cells that actually forms a small pore or a hole between the 2 cells. And that can allow chemical messengers to diffuse directly from one cell into another. Similar thing happens in the heart. There are gap junctions in the heart that allows sodium to diffuse directly from one cell to another. That allows action potentials to propagate all the way through the heart so that the heart can contract as a unit. Another way that cells can communicate is by way of neurotransmitters. That allows one presynaptic neuron to communicate with a postsynaptic neuron. Okay? That's neurotransmitters are the signaling molecule that's found in the nervous system. A third way is through paracrines or paracrine hormones. Paracrine hormones are chemical messengers that are produced by one cell, and it affects adjacent cells. It just gets taken up by adjacent cells and causes a change in the physiology of the adjacent cells. But paracrine hormones can't travel very far. They're not transported by the bloodstream, so they can only affect cells within a small localized area. Hormones, on the other hand, which is the topic of chapter 17, are chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream. And the bloodstream goes all the way through the whole body. So hormones can cause changes in tissues or organs a considerable distance away from where those chemical messengers are produced. Okay? And so hormones are another way whereby one part of the body can communicate with another part of the body. So it kind of does some of the same things as the nervous system, but there's some major differences between the two, especially in the amount of time it takes for those messengers to produce their effect. Since hormones have to travel through the bloodstream, that takes time. And so the endocrine system is a lot slower acting. Consequently, organs that are regulated by the endocrine system tend to be ones whose actions or effects take place over longer periods of time. Whereas the nervous system is very rapid because neural impulses can travel in just a few milliseconds. So the endocrine system is made up of glands, tissues, and cells that secrete hormones, some of which are similar to neurotransmitters like epinephrine and norepinephrine. The study of the endocrine glands and the diagnosis and treatment of its disorders is called endocrinology. So a person that studies the endocrine system and its disorders would be called an endocrinologist. And endocrine glands are organs that are the traditional sources of hormones. And hormones can be defined, hormones are actually defined fairly specifically in order to distinguish them from other kind of chemical messengers like neurotransmitters or or paracrines. So hormones can be defined as chemical messengers transported by the bloodstream that stimulate physiological responses often a considerable distance away from their source. Okay. Now, one other thing that could probably be added to this definition, I think I just took this definition from our textbook, and it's one thing that I learned, and I actually took a course in endocrinology when I was in graduate school, is that hormones are very, very powerful substances. So they're secreted in very minute quantities, but they can have a very, very powerful effect. Okay. All right, so this is just an overview. This shows the locations of some of the major organs of the endocrine system. Now, these are just the major organs because there actually have been there actually are other endocrine organs that are not traditionally thought as of endocrine organs. For example, the heart. I don't know if many of you know about this, but the heart actually secretes two different hormones that are involved in regulation of sodium homeostasis. There's two different natriuretic hormones that regulate the concentration of sodium in the body. But we generally don't think of the heart as an endocrine organ. Also the kidney. Kidney produces hormones. That's another one that we don't usually think of. So these are just the traditional endocrine glands. So the first one is actually part of the brain. It's what biologists call a neuroendocrine organ because it can produce both neurotransmitters as well as hormones, and that is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is probably one of the more important endocrine glands because the hypothalamus produces hormones called releasing factors that cause the pituitary to release its hormones. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. The pituitary in turn affects the activity of many other endocrine glands. Okay? So really the hypothalamus in one sense is the most important one because that controls everything. So the hypothalamus is located in the floor of the diencephalon, which is the second highest level of the brain. And hanging down off of the hypothalamus is another gland called the pituitary. And we're going to take a closer look at the pituitary later on. The pituitary is actually made up of two glands in one. There's an anterior pituitary and then there's a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary produces a number of hormones that regulate other endocrine glands, like the thyroid and the gonads. The posterior pituitary just produces two hormones, one of which is antidiuretic hormone, which regulates water reabsorption of the kidneys, and the other one is oxytocin, which is involved in childbirth. So those are two important hormones that are associated with the brain. So they're located up here in the cranium. And then we have another two important endocrine glands located in the cervical region, which is the neck. The first one is the thyroid gland, which is right here. It's this U-shaped gland. The thyroid gland produces hormones that regulate our basal metabolic rate. Our basal metabolic rate is the baseline rate at which we utilize ATP. Okay, and the hormone, one of the hormones that it releases is thyroxine. Thyroxine, or thyroid hormone, as I said, it regulates our metabolic rate. So if a person's thyroid gland is not producing enough thyroxine, then your body's not going to be using up much energy, and you're going to be rather slow and lethargic. You might even gain weight because your body's not burning up very much energy. Then, embedded in the posterior part of the thyroid gland are two small clusters of cells called the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which is involved in the regulation of blood levels of calcium. So it's involved in calcium regulation. And the parathyroid glands weren't even known to exist early on in the history of medicine. And they were actually discovered when surgeons removed the thyroid gland of some people because they had thyroid cancer. And so in some cases, if they had a really bad case of thyroid cancer, they might remove the whole thyroid gland. And when they did that, they found some of the patients mysteriously died, even though they could supplement the person with thyroxine by injection, or by, actually they could do that by tablet, I guess. Anyway, they eventually found out the reason these patients were mysteriously dying is because when they removed the thyroid, unknowingly, they were removing the parathyroid glands. And that plays such an important role in the regulation of blood levels of calcium. These patients' calcium levels became too low, and it caused them to die, caused them to go into cardiac arrest and die. So that's how the parathyroid glands were discovered. It's kind of an unfortunate accident. All right. Then, in addition, there's another endocrine gland that actually sits just in front of the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta, just superior to the heart, and that's the thymus. The thymus also produces a hormone. Then in the trunk, there's several different endocrine glands. One of them is the pancreas. And the pancreas is another very interesting organ because the pancreas releases two different hormones into the bloodstream which regulate blood sugar, one of which is insulin, I was just talking about a little while ago, and there's another one called glucagon. And insulin, in general, lowers blood glucose levels. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. So the balance of those two hormones determine the concentration of glucose in the blood. But there's also another portion to the pancreas. There's also an exocrine portion. The exocrine portion of the pancreas is involved with the digestive system. And it secretes a fluid that contains a number of different digestive enzymes that help us to digest our food. And it also produces bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a base, and that helps to neutralize the acid from our stomach. So, and that secretions of the pancreas are released into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, which is right below the stomach. And that bicarbonate is important because if the pancreas didn't secrete bicarbonate, then the acid from the stomach would eat away the walls of the duodenum, and it would cause ulcers. And if those ulcers broke through, it could cause infection to spread throughout the body, and it could prove to be fatal. So pancreas mainly secretes insulin and glucagon, and then there's another pair of glands that we talked about in our discussion in chapter 15, the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands both sit right on top of the superior portion of each of the kidneys. The word adrenal, ad means upon or on top of, and renal refers to kidneys. Okay, so they sit right on top of the kidneys. Those are also kind of a combination gland, and also the medulla is part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So it kind of has dual roles. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the division of the nervous system as a whole. And also the outer layer of tissue, which is called the adrenal cortex, that secretes a large number of different hormones, some of which are involved in regulation of fatty acids and glucose in the blood. All right, then finally there's a pair of organs in the pubic region or pelvic region that are involved in reproduction that also secrete hormones, and those are the gonads. The gonads in the male are called the testes, and they sit in a pouch of skin called the scrotum, so they're actually outside of the body cavity. And then in women, the gonads are the ovaries. Both of those organs produce the gametes or sex cells that are involved in reproduction. But the testes and the ovaries also secrete hormones, so they're also an endocrine gland. The primary hormones released by the ovaries are estrogens and progesterone. And in the male, the primary hormone is testosterone, the male hormone. So those are just a few of the many endocrine glands. In this chapter, we're going to talk mainly about the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, since they affect all of the other endocrine glands. And then some of the other ones we'll be talking about when we get to the organ system in which they also participate. So like for the gonads, we'll talk about their structure and function when we get to the reproductive system. That'll be right at the very end of the semester. We'll talk more about the pancreas when we get to the digestive system, since it's involved in the digestive system. But there are some general concepts regarding the endocrine system that I think are important to know, because these are things that all of those endocrine glands have in common. Okay? So one thing that I want to make sure is that we're not confused between an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. Exocrine glands are glands that produce secretions that pass through a duct. Usually there's a narrow duct that carries the secretions into the lumen of another organ. And some examples and there's a number of exocrine glands in the digestive system. Just one example are the salivary glands, which are located around our oral cavity. The salivary glands produce a secretion called saliva, which contains mucus and water, and also an enzyme called salivary amylase. And that's released through a small duct into our oral cavity. And when we eat and we chew our food gets mixed with the saliva, and that starts breaking down starch. Amylase is an enzyme that breaks down starch. Okay. Another example of an exocrine gland is the exocrine portion of the pancreas that produces pancreatic juice, which contains digestive enzymes and bicarbonate. That's released through a duct into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Okay. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, are ductless. They don't release their secretions through a duct. Instead, endocrine glands have numerous capillaries. They're supplied with lots of capillaries through which blood flows, and the cells of the endocrine glands secrete hormones which are taken up by those capillaries. Some of the capillaries are fenestrated, which means that the walls of the capillaries actually have holes in them. And that makes it easier for the hormones to diffuse into the capillaries and go into the bloodstream. So secretion is internal. It's inside the gland itself. And endocrine glands produce intracellular effects in their target organs, such as altering the metabolism of the target organ. Okay? Or it could activate a signaling system in the organ, which can cause some change in the physiology of the organ or tissue. All right, so let's just compare the effects of the endocrine system with the nervous system, because they both control other parts of the body. Both serve for internal communication. The nervous system uses both electrical as well as chemical communication. Chemical portion is the neurotransmitters. The endocrine only uses chemicals for their communication. The speed is very, very different. The nervous system is very fast. So the nervous system does things like activate skeletal muscles. It allows us to react very quickly if our life is in danger. For example, if we start walking across a street and a car comes down the street really fast, it activates our leg muscles so we can get out of the way so we don't get run over. The endocrine system, however, would not be very good for controlling our skeletal muscles because it acts so slowly. The endocrine glands release the hormones in our bloodstream. It circulates through our whole body, and then it takes time for the hormone to cause a change in the effector organ. So endocrine system reacts very slowly. The hormones sometimes take as long as days to take effect, such as the ones that are involved in regulation of the reproductive system. The persistence, or the length of time that the system takes effect is very different. Nervous system, the response declines very quickly. So if a somatic motor neuron is activated that leads to a skeletal muscle, the muscle contracts and twitches, and it goes up what's called a muscle twitch or contraction, and that takes place relatively quickly, and then the effect is over. So the effect may only last maybe a second or two. The persistence of the endocrine system, though, is much longer because the hormones can circulate throughout the bloodstream for a long time. Now, they are eventually removed from the bloodstream or cleared from the bloodstream, but that takes place relatively slowly. So the effects of the endocrine system can be much longer lasting. Okay. So, if you think about it, like, you want your blood glucose levels to remain relatively constant, because if they get too high, it can cause problems with circulation, and it can cause blindness, it can cause heart disease, it can cause strokes. If it gets too low, it can cause you to pass out, okay, like that story I was telling you about today. So, if you want your blood glucose to remain relatively stable, you probably want a chemical messenger that's going to stick around for a long time. So it can maintain a stick. You don't want it to reduce the blood sugar really fast and then have it go right back up again. You want it to stay relatively constant. So the endocrine system can release the proper amount of insulin, and then that has a relatively long-lasting effect. longer than longer than the time that the nervous system acts anyway. And then the area effect is also different. The nervous system generally targets just one specific organ or one general area, whereas the endocrine system can have very widespread effects. There's two hormones that have very wide effects. One of them is thyroxine, or thyroid hormone. That affects almost all the cells in the whole body because it regulates metabolism. And the other one is insulin. Insulin also affects almost all cells. And actually what insulin does, insulin allows cells to take up glucose. So if you don't have enough insulin, your cells can't take up glucose, and it builds up in the blood. And if blood glucose levels get too high, that can have some very harmful effects on other parts of the body. Okay. So if you don't have enough insulin, or if insulin stops having an effect on your body, what do your cells use for energy then? Because glucose is kind of one of the preferred sources of energy, isn't it? It's a chemical. Glucose is a chemical form of energy that can be most directly and most easily broken down and converted into glucose, or converted into ATP, right? So what do your cells use if it doesn't have enough glucose?
Carbohydrate.
Okay, well, glucose is a carbohydrate. Okay. Most carbohydrates, by the way, are broken down into glucose. Okay, so it doesn't matter the source of the glucose. If you don't have enough insulin, you're not going to be able to use that chemical form of energy. So what other kind of molecules can our body use for fuel besides carbohydrates?
Proteins.
Protein is one. Yeah, you could use protein. The problem with using protein, though, is your muscles and your heart are made of protein, and you don't want to be breaking that down. Okay, you don't want to break down your muscles, or you don't want to break down your heart. Okay. So what else could you use besides protein? Fat. Yeah, you can use fat, and actually that's what diabetics use if they don't have enough insulin, or if their body can't use insulin, is they start breaking down fat. Fat is broken down into a compound called acetyl coenzyme A, and so blood levels of acetyl coenzyme A get higher because that's what your body is using for energy. And those acetyl coenzyme A molecules can react with each other to form a compound called a ketone body. And ketone bodies can be used as fuel, but it's also a weak acid, and so it can lower the pH of your body fluids, and that can causes a condition called ketoacidosis. Okay. But ketone bodies are useful. They can be used as fuel, but you don't want too much of them. So that's another test that diabetics sometimes do. Besides testing their blood sugar, they also test for ketone bodies, because if their ketone bodies are too high, that means that, well, if they're a type 1 diabetic, which is the type you can treat with insulin, if your ketone bodies are too high, that's a sign that you don't have enough insulin. So you need to change your dose of insulin. Okay, we're out of time, so this is a good place for us to stop. So we'll stop here. And Friday we'll start talking about some general properties of hormones.